Hi. Hi. Hey. This is Avocado Inc. And we are here on this lovely General Conference weekend to bring to you
a message about the Antichrist. That's the gist. We wanted to go through and find the instances where they talk about Antichrist or just like anti-church rhetoric in the Book of Mormon and give them a little bit of a read through. Because, like, represent.
Absolutely. And so welcome back to this segment of our mini-series on the Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
I suppose this is episode 3 of that, though we haven't technically been keeping track.
We don't keep track of very many things.
No, we don't, as you can tell, if you have, for some reason, followed us to any extent here.
So for those following along at home,
oh yeah,
you want to open your Book of Mormons to Alma 30.
This is Korihor. Just for interest's sake, we did confirm that there are only 2 instances in the Book of Mormon when people are specifically called antichrists, and that is Sherem, chapter 7 of Jacob, and Korihor. There are a couple of other examples that get close, but they aren't actually called antichrists. So
yes,
we decided to focus on these for technicality's sake. And it is in Alma 30, starting at verse 6. And technically, his story goes all the way to the end of the chapter.
Get a whole chapter.
Yeah, it's a lot. It is a lot. But it's really only until like 46 that there's kind of a content of theological discussion going on. So first thing that I want to bring up is I want to talk about kind of situating what it means to be antichrist before we delve into, Joseph's steel man of the antichrist position. It's interesting because the antichrist position, as it is described in the Book of Mormon, is what you would call an agnostic or an atheist position in today's vernacular. So what he does not mean by antichrist is some kind of vicious disillusionment from the gospel. I know that we often talk about it that way, but if you read this chapter carefully, you'll see that that's not the case. The things that Korihor in particular is presenting are things that are really basic. Things like life ends with death, that basically churches can manipulate people in the name of like eternal glory, and that these that you can't prove stuff. That like you can't prove that Christ is coming, you can't prove that God exists, and thus why do you believe in it? So these are very clearly like simple claims. I want to make that good from the outset, and this is part of the reason that I was so interested in talking about this, is because these claims are like, they're the sort of claims that we're making.
Yeah. Like I said, representation.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, we're like responding to, Alma's response to us.
On that note, the whole we already mentioned that it's like a steelman or an attempt at a steelman of this position. There are a few ways you could view that. You could view this as Joseph Smith was writing the Book of Mormon, made up the Book of Mormon, and therefore this is just Joseph's attempt to, present the opposing side and his response to it in his religious text. But you don't actually have to like forfeit the Book of Mormon to view this as a steelman of it, because you could assume that like God would have only what is good in the Book of Mormon and what is useful. And so if God ever allows you to include rhetoric from the other side in your Book of Mormon, you can pretty much guarantee that it's there for you to learn something. So it is, in a way, like either Joseph Smith or God's attempts at steel manning our position in the Book of Mormon, so that the members of the church are aware of what it is and how to respond to it.
Yes.
I will say that, like, saying that it was Joseph Smith seems like a nicer thing to do. Because if this is God's depiction of what is going on with us, then I have some thoughts about God. Anyways.
Yeah, it actually does seem more generous to give it to Joseph Smith, honestly.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's just interact with what's written here and see what comes of it. So I will direct your attention to the beginning of Alma 30. I have it pulled up here to make sure that we are doing this in a way that can actually be followed. And so there's a guy, Korihor, he comes into the land of Zarahemla, and he is preaching against the coming of Christ. Okay. And this is a free society, very similar to early America, it seems, where, there's no laws against believing things, and you can choose to believe in God, and that's all fine and dandy. There, if you did bad things, then you would get punished, but you can't be punished for, saying something.
Yes. And verse 7, we have, it was strictly contrary to the commands of God that there should be a law which bring men onto unequal grounds. So that's kind of their justification for allowing him to talk in the first place.
Yes. And I want to go back to this unequal grounds point because theologically that gets more complicated. Remember that this is a time of great faithfulness for the people in the land of Zarahemla. So like pretty much everyone is part of the same church. Alma's been going around and preaching. And so yeah, this is presented as a highly minor view, or this is a marginalized view that Korihor is presenting, which is another interesting sociological point. He goes around and he preaches a few things in particular, and I want to read them just so we know exactly what he's trying to say. The first is that in 12, he began to preach unto the people that there should be no Christ. And he calls this people being bound under a foolish and vain hope. Why do you look for Christ? For no man can know of anything which is to come, in 13. In 14, he criticizes prophecies. He's like, look, these things that you say are handed down from holy prophets, they're just, foolish traditions, because how can you know? You can't know of things that you can't see. And therefore, you can't know that there shall be a Christ. You can't know that these prophecies are going to be yada, yada, or whatever. Now, this is the next point is a very common way of describing what you might call the atheist position on why people would come to believe these things, right? Because if they are all foolish, then why is it that people believe foolish things? So in 16, this is really important. He says, you look forward and see that and say that ye see a remission of your sins. So this is point number 1, that there is a kind of hope that we look forward to, and this hope gives us a reason to believe in things that would otherwise be foolish. Okay, this is actually a very good steel man. This is a point that a lot of people brought up in Joseph's time as well as today.
Currently, yeah.
But behold, it is the effect of a frenzied mind and such arrangement of your mind, and it comes about because of traditions. This is also a fantastic point, because we have made this exact point. In an earlier episode, we talked about conservative inertia and how there's this sense in which, because something is a tradition, it gains a certain amount of of ideological power and perceived force in our lives. And so, by and large, yes, I would agree with this, which leads you away into a belief of things which are not so. And those are the main points. It says he says many other things, but it doesn't actually say what it is besides critiquing the atonement.
Well, I would actually like to point to 17 because there's one more thing I really like here. He said that, I'll just read the whole thing. And many more such things did he say unto them, telling them that there could be no atonement made for the sins of man, but every man fared in his life according to the management of the creature. Therefore every man prospered according to his genius, and that every man conquered according to his strength, and whatsoever a man did was no crime. There's a couple different parts to that, but the one that I find most interesting is that fared in his life according to the management of his creature is one way of putting how most atheists kind of take their life to work. Like they're just like, if I as a human being like live in certain ways, then my life is a certain way, and that's about as far as the calculus goes. There's not like some correlation to an afterlife. So
yeah, no, I'm glad you caught me, because this has more as well. This points out the prosperity gospel as well. He says, therefore, every man prospered according to his genius, and that every man conquered according to his strength. The opposition to that would obviously be that prosperity and strength come from God.
Yes, exactly.
And not from your own merits. Now, the whatsoever man did was no crime. This is a straw man.
Yes. There's you will not find atheists who say this.
This is just silly. And if you think about it for a second, you realize why it's silly. It comes out of a very particular conversation. If I were to just guess from Joseph's mind, assuming that Joseph was the one who wrote this sort of thing comes from a conversation about objective and subjective morality, which has been around for a very, very long time using different words, but it means the same thing. It's the question of like, is something really wrong if there isn't a higher moral law that's dictating that it's wrong? You know, what makes a crime a crime? But the problem is, to say that whatsoever a man did was no crime is actually a more extreme position of that, and that's why I call it a straw man, because even if you take subjective morality to be the existent state of things, that doesn't mean that there aren't crimes.
Yes,
that just means that the ontological explanation for crimes or morality in general is different, but you can still have crimes. Like if I think that something you did was a crime, that still means something, even if you say that it means something less than an objective analysis of that would mean.
I'm kind of curious because now I'm wondering if in the 1800s, when this was first published, I wonder if there were some thoughts circulating about this sort of thing, because if I'm correct, the 1800s is when we first started getting people really discussing like social contract theory and like natural selection, and all of these things were starting to become like public points of discussion. And the idea that like it's just your strength and your mind that matters, and then all of the human structure is just kind of like forced on top of you, that there is no actual right or wrong. I think there were some things that originated in that time period that were pointing in that direction, which quickly fell apart as people developed social contract theory and other theories of sociology. But
I think you're right. Hobbes and Locke are both before Joseph.
Yes,
Darwin was after Joseph. If I'm remembering this timeline correctly, but I know Hobbes and Locke were before. So this conversation about morality as an emergent property of social contracts was definitely part of the discourse.
Okay, good to situate that.
Yeah. So that part doesn't really match very well, but everything else he said so far has been pretty awesome. And then you're right, there is another point in 18, which is telling them that when a man was dead, that was the end thereof. This is obviously a steelman as well, because this is a central point of a lot of non-religious thinking. And the other part of 18, though, is also, I mean, it could be true of Korihor, but it's not very representative of the general, what you might call atheist or agnostic approach. Like there's no sense in which you saying any of the rest of these things that we've lined up means that you have to say, thus you're going to lift up your head in your wickedness and leading away many women and also men to commit whoredoms. Those aren't necessarily connected to each other in any meaningful way.
I will point out that the use of whoredoms here is kind of important, because there's a sense in which a lot of people will argue that being an atheist is wickedness regardless of how you do it, just because you're denying God. But to specifically say whoredoms entails that they are then further doing, like, there's a certain group of things we consider whoredoms. And so it's not just them being like, they're no longer religious, that means they're wicked. It's them actually saying like, oh no, they went and like started hurting people and doing evil acts in society. And that's definitely not necessarily going to follow from atheism. In fact, the opposite seems to be true. Atheists are the least incarcerated group among ideologies. So it's like, at least nowadays, I don't know what it was like in Zarahemla, but being an atheist is not correlated with committing crimes or doing awful things.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really follow at all. Okay, so now we've got an interesting story point that I want to make clear. In 19, it says, this man then, so he was in Zarahemla, and now he's going over to the land of Jershon, which is the heritage land, also to preach these lands, things among the people of Ammon, who were once the people of the Lamanites. And it says, but behold, they were more wise than many of the Nephites, for they took him and bound him and carried him before Ammon, who was the high priest over the people. And it came to pass that he caused that he should be carried out of the land. I just want to point out, at the beginning of this chapter, we had this whole discourse on how in Zarahemla, they couldn't stop him from saying things because it wasn't illegal to have beliefs.
Yeah, all men were equal before God on the same standing.
And now it's being praised that that basically Korihor is being censured by content.
Yeah. And censured in like the most extreme way.
He's getting thrown out.
He's getting tied up and carried out of the country.
So anyway, that's very inconsistent. Like, you've got to either praise the one or the other. It's either got to be that God wants us to all be on equal footing, so that we're free to choose and we're open to all beliefs as being presented to us, or the correct thing to do is to refer again to a previous conversation that we had, control the enticements that you can possibly have.
Yes.
Such as, that you could be enticed by Korihor, and thus the holy thing to do is to remove the enticement.
Yep.
Right? Yep. Those are not congruent. It's got to be one or the other.
Actually, right here, the other example that we mentioned, Sherem from Jacob 7, much earlier. This would be like hundreds of years, actually, probably prior to this instance.
I forget the exact date. But it's been a while.
Yeah, well, it would have had to have been, because Jacob was the son of Lehi, which was, like 500 BC or something?
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
And this is Ammon, so much later. Anyway, the earlier, Sherem actually is the one who seeks out Alma, the person in charge of the government. So it's a very different setup, where in this case, they bound him and took him to the leadership that then disposed of him. In the previous one, Sherem goes to the leadership, asks the leadership for a sign, and then his sign apparently is that he is, essentially dies. And that you don't have the same issue in the last one.
That's a good point. Okay, so he goes before he goes into the land of Gideon next, and goes before the high priest Gidonah, which is interesting because I always get confused with Gidonai. It's very similar names. And he asks these questions. So why do you go about perverting the ways of the Lord? Why do you teach this people that there should be no Christ, to interrupt their rejoicings? And why do you speak against all the prophecies of the holy prophets? I just want to point out, Korihor's message was that he didn't think that people had sufficient ground on which they could base their belief. And thus there was no reason to, choose to have this belief over any other particular belief. This would be an agnostic position. But Gidona he's making a very different sort of claim against him. He's saying it's kind of like coming from the presupposition that the church is true, that it gives you good things, that the Lord is real. So you're asking, why are you perverting the ways of the Lord? Pervert is a very, like, this is an action-filled word. It means to make something askew or wrong in a certain way. You're taking something that was right and you're making it wrong. So in other words, those aren't the same claims. So we went from a real steelman of the position to now the questions that are being asked are not referencing that steelman anymore. Because to reference the steelman would be to say something like, why is it that you don't think that we have sufficient reason to believe in God? Right? Something simple like that. No, but to say pervert the ways of the Lord and interrupt people's rejoicings, I suppose there's something to that, but that presupposes that people are happier when believing in Christ than when they aren't.
Yeah, which I will point out is exactly what Korihor then responds with. He basically is just like, these people aren't rejoicing, you're just controlling them, and they're actually like, they're kept down by your beliefs here. I guess reading it would probably be good. Now the high priest's name was Gidona, and Korihor said unto him, because I do not teach the foolish traditions of your fathers, and because I do not teach the people to bind themselves down under the foolish ordinances and performances which are laid down by ancient priests to usurp power and authority over them, to keep them in ignorance, that they may not lift up their heads, but be brought down according to thy word. Doesn't specifically reference rejoicing there, but you can tell what his message is. It's that they're actually worse off where they are right now. I'm not interrupting them so much as trying to like liberate them, or at least that's the rhetoric he's giving us.
You say that this people is a free people. Behold, I say they are in bondage. You say that those ancient prophecies are true. Behold, I say that ye do not know that they are true. I love these lines because I think this is like the strongest way of putting it, that it's not just that, you might not have sufficient reason to believe something. Korihor is then putting forward what you might call the atheist response and not just the agnostic response, which is this notion that taking on unwarranted belief can actually be bad.
Yeah, it's not blissful ignorance.
Exactly. This point is a very notable theological point of Joseph's time. You say that this people is a guilty and a fallen people because of the transgression of a parent. Behold, I say the child is not guilty because of its parents. He's mostly saying the same thing. So I wanted to go, and you say also that he shall be slain for the sins of the world. But this is the foolish traditions of your fathers according to your own desires, and you keep them down so you can glut yourselves off the labor of their hands. So now we've reached the kind of the empirical claim that the bad thing that's occurring, he's trying to say, are the leaders of the church glutting themselves off of the offerings of the people in the church. And so they're like, well, we don't know what to do about this guy in 29. And so they bind him up again. This seems to be a consistent theme, right? That whole free speech thing was really strong in the beginning. And they delivered him up into the hands of the officers and sent him to the land of Zarahemla. So he goes back to Zarahemla, to Alma, and the chief judge, who's the governor over all the... And those are two different people. So Alma is not the chief judge right now. He gives his big speech to Alma, and now we get to the interesting part. So we've got... This is the completion of the presentation of the Antichrist position. Hopefully, it's been clear up to this point. This next part is Alma's basically refutation, or Joseph's refutation, whatever it is. This is the presentation of what's so wrong with what we've presented so far. And I want to reiterate that most of what Korihor has been saying has been, they've been partially empirical and partially just kind of like simply logical. So there are some ways in which I think anyone has to give Korihor some due. That his point about not being able to know things unless you can actually see them is something I think we need to take very seriously. We did a whole episode on problems of trying to say that you know things with through some like indirect epistemological method like faith. So this isn't like a crazy point. That's a really reasonable point. And then there's also this concern about the way that churches can exploit people and control people.
The phrase is used earlier where it says that denies them their access to their rights and privileges. And that's, I think, a common concern.
And the empirical part of it that I want to point out that becomes difficult in Alma's response is that Alma's going to talk a lot about how happy the people are, how joyful they are, and how basically what Korihor is doing is challenging their happiness. I feel like this is key to understanding how people normally read this, because when I was reading this, when I was younger, this is what I thought about. I was like, well, yeah, no, but people in the church are so much happier. That's the whole point, right? It's all about being happy, and like, yeah, you might see a certain amount of logic in Korihor's points, but that doesn't make it actually like
great plan of happiness is still
right?
great. And actually, when you talk to members of the church, frequently, if you ever like bring them to question some type of thing in the theology or the cosmology or their practice or whatever, if you say, like, well, do you really think this is a good thing? The usual fallback, which comes up very quickly, usually, like in most cases, is, well, this makes me feel happier. Like my life is happier and better doing this. So the appeal to happiness is a big thing today in just discourse on this subject.
And this is an empirical claim. I don't know. I feel like somebody's going to try and just listen. They're going to hear that and they're going to be like, no, it's not empirical somehow. But I don't know how you get out of that in reality. Like, this is the sort of thing where we should be able to tell whether people are happy or not. Like, there's some way that we can measure this. And I just want to point out that it's not as simple as Alma puts it. Because if we take the gospel that Alma's talking about to be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then we can measure happiness in the church and outside of the church. And there have been so many different studies of the smaller scales and larger scales. And I just want to emphasize that the story just isn't that. It's not the case that, if you are in the church, you will be happier than if you were outside the church.
And the interesting thing is that you actually see that in a lot of discourse from the church. They talk about how like things won't always be happy, but it's like there's maybe some like sum total that they're arguing for. But the point is that if it is an empirical thing, if it will make you more happy on average, or however you want to do it, then it tells us something about how we should evaluate that claim. And that is through empirical research, which like one of the biggest critiques or like oppositions that I've gotten to trying to tell people that like your people outside the church are just as happy is that they say, well, happiness is a difficult thing to measure. And the response to that is just, Yeah, no, you're right. It's a difficult thing to measure, but that doesn't mean that we don't like we just give up on measuring it and assume that you're right. Like that would mean that we find the best measurement that we can, and then we use that one for the justification. Like the point is that like we do try to measure it, and we develop studies that are like carefully orchestrated to try and get at who is the most happiest in the world. We do this. We're very invested in happiness. And maybe you disagree with those studies, but as far as we can tell, they are the closest thing to an actual empirical argument towards one group or another being happy. You just saying that this is the case makes it no longer an empirical claim because we can't test it empirically, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I tend to think that what was going through Joseph's mind throughout all of this was that this is the sort of thing that would be empirically demonstrated over time. That like the church would be so clearly like being in the church would be so obviously better for you than to be out of it, right? Anyway, so there's some thoughts to think about. The whole causing joy in the hearts thing, like there's a narrative here that's being put, and you got to ask yourself which one will actually make you happy. And in order to do that, you've got to go from an unbiased position, because I hear all too often people say silly stuff like, oh, but I could never or would never want to be agnostic or atheist in my position because I would be so sad.
Yeah.
How would I have happiness in my life? But anyway, it's just it doesn't make any sense. Because you've got people telling you that they're happy, you just don't believe them.
I think a great example of this is if you look at the statistics on happiness around the globe, you have I'm not going to be the type of person that says there are countries that are the most happy. They're what's it called? Scandinavian countries usually.
Oh yeah.
And then say, well, they're the most atheist, therefore we can draw that correlation. I think that's like way too broad of a claim to make. But at least what we can do is say, look, large swaths of hundreds of thousands of atheists in the Scandinavian countries are happy, and they're like some of the happiest people in the world. You don't need to take that to mean anything about the ideologies themselves, but it should at least say that like happiness is not determined by the ideology, that it's probably something else, or a combination of other things, but that any claim that is going to be saying one way or the other, which is what Alma is saying, is going to be something that just isn't supported by evidence.
Cool. And so now there's this other part, which is about whether the people are being glutted.
Glutted.
Yeah. So Korihor claims that the leaders of the church are taking a bunch of money from the people. And Alma's like, I've never received so much as one senine for my labor, verse 33. Neither has any of my brethren, save it were in the judgment seat, and then we have received only according to law for our time. And that's pretty much the end of that. And so I just want to say, in this world of Zarahemla, regardless of whether it's real or not, that seems like a perfectly reasonable response. If that's all true, then cool. Korihor was completely wrong.
Yes.
End of story. What I'd like to do, though, is just point out how this relates to the modern church, who's, obviously their direct claim is that this is the same church that existed then. And so, and just slightly problematize that, because the church has had to change their narrative on this front a number of times.
Yeah.
Because they do pay their leaders. Mm-hmm. And there have been problems in which you could say that they were unreasonably asking for money from people, even if you say that it was in the name of God, from trying to put this in a neutral way.
It's difficult.
It is
very difficult.
It is. let me just throw out some more concrete examples, and maybe that will be helpful. So it's common knowledge now because it came out, but people didn't know for a long time that members of the Q15 were given, and by that I mean, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the First Presidency, were given a modest stipend. And for a long time, people didn't know how much that was. Some people weren't even aware of the stipend. Anyway, this got kind of leaked, and then they had to be upfront about it.
Yeah.
And we are now aware that a modest stipend, if I'm remembering correctly, is a good amount over 100,000 a year. Is like 120. Anyway, something around there. And this made a lot of people upset because that's not a small amount of money.
Yeah.
In fact, that's not even close to a small amount of money.
It's more than double the poverty line.
Yes. Yeah.
Which a lot of people are living under.
There's a lot of ways you could
throw that out there. I'm just saying, a C9 is the equivalent of a penny in theirs.
Yeah. And they are not judges. I don't know how to put this any more clearly. Like, Alma specifically says he's the prophet. He's the spiritual leader of the church. And he says he has not been paid anything for his labor ever. He literally travels around and people just feed him. Mm-hmm. And like, it makes it very clear that for Alma, this is like a labor of intense solitude and difficulty, and it brings him a lot of happiness, but there's obviously no wealth in this at all.
Yes, exactly.
And that the judges get paid, yes, but that's because they're a government office, and that's how they had it set up, and that's fine. I mean, because that's not a religious office. But in other words, you can't compare the Q15 to the judges, because I don't see how that makes any sense.
They're not judges.
If we're to take this argument seriously, then there's a disparity between Alma and the Q15 and that's how the church has worked for a long time, as these people get paid. Now, granted, the logic for it is just that it's basically giving them the money to be able to like live and stuff so that they can, do their ministry full time. I just want to point out that those numbers don't make sense either, because they get paid far more than would be necessary to just live, or even to live and travel a lot, or even to, it just doesn't work out. So there is obviously a disparity there, and I want to make that clear. And in that sense, I think that Korihor's point actually stands against the current church, where he is saying there's a certain way in which people are being asked to pay regardless of their financial situation, and that the leaders of the church are directly benefiting from this in a way that is that goes beyond just basic sustenance. So
yeah, I would like to add there that the stipend is one thing, but there's also a lot of other ways you can measure wealth and glutting off of things. Not that you need to call it that, but that is what the argument is calling it here. The point is, it's like the stipend is a direct amount of money, but they also receive some of the best healthcare, period, which is one of the largest expenses that any person in the United States has. Which means that they're actually
their families.
Yeah, and their families. And then there's a lot about their just general lifestyle that is completely compensated for or provided by the LDS Church at large. So the stipend is not all of it.
Yeah. No, I totally forgot about that. And that was fantastic. I mean, if you are like directly related to any of these people, you have free college, you have free healthcare, you have just like access to a bunch of stuff. I know they even like sometimes get just like free food and stuff from places. Like, I'm pretty sure the places that they go to in Salt Lake, they don't pay for, is the last thing I heard about. But anyway, the point is there's a lot of just like perks.
A lot of definitely perks.
Yeah. So, you know, we should take Korihor's point seriously. If it doesn't apply to the people of Zarahemla, fine and dandy. Maybe it applies to today. And so we can just move on from that part completely. So if we jump down to, he brings up this happiness point again in 35. And now believest thou that we deceive this people that causes such joy in their hearts? Again, this is an empirical claim. Korihor's response beforehand was, you're yoking these people down and they could be happier otherwise. So this is the sort of thing that can actually be investigated. And it isn't investigated here, obviously. But now we get into kind of the theological refutation.
Yes. Believest thou that there is a God? Should be obvious at this point.
Nay.
No. Yeah, nay.
Will you deny again that there is a God and also deny the Christ? For behold, I say unto you, I know that there is a God and also that Christ shall come. And I love this point. And this is where I wanted to get onto unequal grounds. In 40, Alma says, and now what evidence have ye that there is no God, that Christ cometh not? I say unto you that ye have none, save it be your word only. But behold, I have all things as a testimony that these things are true, and ye also have all things as a testimony to you that they are true. And will ye deny them? Believest that these things are true? Okay, now I don't want to go on to 42. If you know this story, he then says, I know that you believe and that you're just possessed by a lying spirit. And then it basically eventually kind of proves that that is the case, because Korihor gets cursed and he's like, yeah, I believed all the time, but I had this evil spirit. So I don't want to go there because that is no longer a representation of the current discourse.
Or just argument in general. Like, it becomes an argument about a particular case that supposedly happened, is the idea. And so there's no way we could say that what happened to Korihor is representative of a larger group than just Korihor, even if we can say it's representative of Korihor, because I don't know if he's a real person. But
and well, okay, we can engage with it a little bit in this way, that if we do take it to be a representative case, then this should say something about us, right? Like,
possessed here.
Yeah, and when are we going to get struck down so we can know the error of our ways? And we are not a small representation. Like, this is extremely widely held view.
I will say that it is a 2 for 2 in the Book of Mormon, because Sherem also gets struck down.
Yes.
And dies within a day. So it at least as far as the Book of Mormon goes, definitely portrays being an antichrist as the sort of thing that is quite directly correlated with a, smite.
Which, I mean, actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Doesn't happen, but it makes sense for the rhetoric.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense that it doesn't happen today. We're obviously missing something there. Why am I not getting struck down for saying these things?
There's a lot of reasons. You should be worried.
Oh man, that would be kind of epic though.
Yeah, right. Actually.
I think about that sometimes.
Literally 1 in a million to get, struck by lightning.
Like, imagine being the person that, like, through my death, it gets proved that God exists.
That would actually be cool.
Like, I'm the reason. Everyone's like, wow, yeah, being an antichrist is actually, like, bad, right? I feel like I could have a certain amount of pride in that. Because at least then I think people would have a reasonable foundation for believing
Which we would like to point out. This is what Korihor is all about, it seems, is that he's like, look, reasons, have evidence to do this sort of thing. So, Korihor then becomes a reason for the Nephites. to believe in God.
That's
so
such a good point.
Maybe he fulfilled his purpose. Maybe he would be happy with where he was at.
Not that that's even remotely fair to Korihor.
It's not.
because if everyone else got convinced by the reason that was his demise,
the poor guy didn't have anything to go off of.
Then that is an argument that reasons are a valid way to place your faith.
Which means they should have taken him seriously.
Yeah, well, and
this seems to fall apart.
And that means that God should have given him reasons, right? Now, here's the thing: is that Alma's going to argue that God did give him reasons.
Yes,
and that is what I just read. But behold, I have all things as a testimony that these things are true. Okay, we are going to dig into this a little bit. First, I want to point out in 40, this is a huge disparity, and it does not make any sense. Think about this for a second. And now what evidence have ye that there is no God? This is what is classically known as the shift of the burden of proof. When you are making a positive claim about the world, you are the one who has to present evidence for that claim.
Yes.
You cannot turn around to the person who is defending the non-positive view, or in other words, just the agnostic point of view, as them needing to have some kind of evidence for their position.
Yes. And actually, here it's important to explain why this is the case. So if you are presenting a positive belief about the world, that something does exist in the world, then you all simultaneously have the task of defining what it is, so that you can prove that it exists. If you're taking up a negative claim about the world, you have to be responding to something to say that this thing that someone has defined as existing does not actually exist. But the term God is an ill-defined term. It's interpreted different ways by different people. It could have a bajillion different meanings. So if you were to actually give us what God is, we could actually attempt a negative proof of him existing. So if you were to say Christ was God and he existed at this point, that's a positive claim, very well defined. Then we could actually start to try and prove that Christ didn't exist if he didn't exist. We could go excavate where it happened and try and find evidence of him existing. And I think the evidence does point towards him existing, at least in some form. But the idea is that the reason you can't just prove that there is no God is that no one has told us what God means at this point. I could say, God doesn't exist, here's my proof, and you would just say that, oh, well, you're referring to something that isn't God. You've disproven not God. So there's this misconception that it's impossible to disprove God. I would say it is possible to disprove God if you can tell me what God is first. Then I can try to disprove it. I can't disprove something that hasn't been defined yet, though.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. That was a little speed round.
yeah. No, I love it. So maybe just to define a couple of points clearly to see, to make that easier to follow. You can make a positive claim about the world that God exists. You can also make the claim that, I believe in a world that is prior to whether or not I know that God exists. So I believe that there is an existence, and then I just don't have anything to say about whether God exists. Okay. And then you can also take the position of somebody has made a positive claim that a particular kind of God exists and it has the particular qualities that it does. And then I have evidence against that particular claim.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a refutation.
Yes. Now, the point, though, is that there is a burden of proof amongst these, in that the person who takes the agnostic position, who believes in a world that is technically prior to whether or not God exists or not, is taking the safest position. They technically have to have the least amount of proof in order to maintain their position, because everyone maintains their position in a very real sense. Whether you're trying to say that there is a God, you also maintain that there is also an existence that is in some way prior to the God knowledge or separate to it, right? And so you can validate the agnostic's claim or lack of claim without having to engage with your further argument. And the same can be true of the kind of anti-theist claim. And the one that requires the most proof is for the positive claim. And normally this isn't a problem, right? If I say I own a dog, that is a positive claim. And to everyone else who doesn't already have immediate reason to believe that I own a dog, they don't need to believe me until they have proof, right? The burden of proving that I have a dog completely rests with me, but that's perfectly fine because I can just show them my dog. The problem with the God conversation is that I can say there is a God, but that doesn't make the truth of there being a God immediately obvious to everyone else. And so sometimes people take the evidence that they think that they have about God, which is usually is kind of loose evidence, some of what we've already talked about before. But if that evidence doesn't immediately convince people that God exists, then there's like this response is really tempting of then, like, if you can't convince them with your positive proof, you turn around and you're like, okay, but what evidence do you have that there isn't a God? Just imagine if I did that with my dog example. So I don't have a dog. I mean, or you don't know if I have a dog. I just tell you that I have a dog, okay? And my only evidence that I show you that I have this dog is I'm just like, I don't know, I tell you about some like feeling that I had this dog, okay? And you, as somebody outside the situation, you're just like
not convinced.
Yeah, you're just like, I just don't find that convincing. And I'm like, well, I find it convincing. What evidence do you have that I don't have a dog? And to you, you're just like, what does that have to do with anything? Right?
Yeah.
How is this even remotely related to the question of if you have a dog? Like,
because you could ask that same question about anything. You could just be like, what evidence do you have that I don't have a pet octopus? And then it's like, oh, well, now I have to like figure that out. The point is that like we organize this burden of proof in a very purposeful way, and having the person who makes the positive claim be the one that is required to present evidence is it's an important and common sense type thing if you put it in any other situation. An important example is in the legal system. The idea is if you make a positive claim about another person that they committed a crime, it is up to you to prove that.
They're innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly.
Yes.
We wouldn't take someone to court and say, prove that you're innocent.
Yeah.
Because first off, it's just like impossible to do that kind of thing. You can't prove your innocence because you would have to prove, unless you had like a particular alibi. The idea is that like we don't just gather proof for random things that people might ask of us and then just have those to present. It's got to be something that is presented to us that we then refute if someone's making a claim about us.
So there's the point about that. And so I just wanted to point out that 39 is kind of a silly line of questioning. I hope that none of you ever use this as like actually trying to talk to people about God, because it's so disingenuous. But we are going to directly engage with the evidence that he is presenting for God. Mm-hmm. So we're going to take this other position where you say, okay, tell us who the God is and what attributes they are, and we can talk about the evidence that exists. So if we jump down to 44, this is Alma's argument. Thou hast had signs enough. Will ye tempt your God? Will ye say, show unto me a sign, when ye have the testimony of all these thy brethren, and also all the holy prophets? The scriptures are laid before thee, yea, and all things denote there is a God, yea, even the earth, and all things that are upon the face of it, and its motion, yea, and all the planets which move in their regular form do witness. What? What do they witness? That there is a supreme creator. Okay. This is fascinating, because in his own argument, he points out that the evidence that he's bringing up doesn't get him to the God that he's talking about. No, what it gets him to specifically is what he calls a supreme creator.
Yeah. Capital S, capital C.
I love it when people do stuff like this because, it's just proving your own point. Yeah. So
it's kind of wild because you're like, if you thought that all of this was actually obvious enough to prove just like to anyone at all the stuff was signs enough to prove that like the God that we're discussing here is real, then you would have just ended that sentence with this proves that there's a God. But you didn't. Instead, you ended with supreme creator, which maybe you could say that's accidental, but to me it sounds like what's being said here is, oh, I admit that these things don't prove there's a God. They do prove that there is a creator, though.
Yes.
Which is already going to like prove the point that this isn't evidence enough for God. You've actually kind of just let that out of the bottle. You're like, this is not evidence enough for God. It's evidence for a creator, though. And then we'll draw from creator to God is, I think, the strategy. But it is kind of fascinating that they kind of just give us that one.
Yeah. And this isn't surprising at all if we take Joseph Smith to be the author of the Book of Mormon, because this is a famous argument for God. The movement of the heavens, I mean, this is what people like, all the way back to Aristotle and Plato have been talking about this, about how could we possibly have the world that we do unless there was a supreme creator. The funny thing is, though, that the nature of this creator has been fiercely debated. For Plato, the ultimate creation was this world of forms, which was very different from Aristotle's idea that there must be an unmoved mover, the prime mover. And then you've got different ideas with Aquinas.
Yeah, because Aquinas picked Augustine. Up what Aristotle was putting down and was like, yeah, actually, God as a creator would just be this very, very pure, almost infinitely reducible, like prime mover type thing. And that was like, he defined a lot of theological thought for a long time. I mean, they have a thing called Thomism. It's people who follow the teachings of Thomas Aquinas within theology. It's kind of interesting.
And so what do we actually get? What this argument, if you think about it for a second, if all things denote that there is a God, the earth and everything that moves upon it and the motion and the planets, if that is direct evidence for God, then why is it that the vast majority of people who observe these things all the time, who live in them all the time, do not come to the same conclusion? I will say that a lot of them come to the conclusion that there's a supreme creator, which is why I think it's funny that he uses that phrase. I'll agree with that. That's a common notion for humans, is to look at the world around us and be like, this couldn't have come about by chance. This kind of a notion exists in cultures across the world. But the problem is that doesn't get you to God. And I know that there are people listening to this who, when I say that, are going to be like, of course it gets you to the same God. People just don't realize it's the same God. It's the idea that like truth exists everywhere.
Yeah, and we all end up at the same place if we follow it hard enough.
Yeah. To be frank, that argument only works if you know very little about other religions.
Yeah. It's a bit of almost an embarrassing take.
Like, it just shows how little you are explicitly recognizing the contradictory nature of religions. Religions don't pair well at all. You can't just say that everyone has bits of truth and that means, cool, we are all like, I don't know, influenced to the same evidence of a creator, because even okay, let's make this very concrete. Even the example of the nature of a supreme creator is wildly inconsistent across nations. Take a fun example of like Brahman from Indian philosophy. This idea is fundamentally Brahman is everything, and everything that you are is part of everything. Everything is Brahman, but there are kind of instantiations of things that exist, whether those be Atman or different gods, but they're all ultimately part of Brahman. This, if we were to translate this into Christian speak, this would mean literally everything is the same thing, and that same thing is God, and we're all just kind of like interesting instantiations of God in a very direct way. Like we're literally God while also being unique at the same time. You can see this is in no way similar. The only point at which you get a similarity point is like that there is a greater narrative, I guess.
Yeah, you wouldn't even want to call it a supreme creator in the sense that because that creates like an idea that it's a being or like has an identity, or...
yeah because they technically have gods who are kind of, they have creation stories like Shiva, the great destroyer, and but these instantiations, they aren't really different than Brahman. Everything is fundamentally Brahman, so it's a completely different notion of how things work. Anyway,
well, and then also I would like to say that like even in Christianity you get wildly different conceptions of the supreme creator and what that entails. Last semester was reading Simone Weil, who was a Christian philosopher, and like her conception of what a supreme creator would be and what that would mean for us required the supreme creator to just like leave reality, and then this is just what's left. That was the creative act for her conception of cosmology. And you have to note that is like it definitely blames God for the existence of all of this, but it blames it in an exact opposite way of how the LDS tradition or most traditions of Christianity would have God be responsible for creation. They would say God created this because you needed someone to actively create this sort of thing. Whereas Simone Weil takes the exact opposite, which is that like God withdrew from reality and this is just what was left. And so it's like even if you say that there is a supreme creator and you can agree on that, you might be agreeing in ways that are so opposite it might just be worth saying you disagree.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we could definitely push that ball down the hill quite a ways. I mean, do you think the world works the way John Calvin thought it works? I mean, he would argue that there's a supreme creator and that everything denotes that there is a supreme creator. He's completely on board with you up until that point, until he says, yeah, but also like everything's completely predetermined and the people who get saved are just those who would get saved, right? And there is no choice in any of that. And I'm sure you would balk at that idea if you are a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or something like that. So anyway, kind of a weird argument. I get how it's a very tempting argument, but hopefully we've shown that it doesn't logically follow to what he wants it to be. But there is a further point that I need to make, which is, do these things actually witness that there's a supreme creator? Because we've just been talking about different notions of a supreme creator and how that's problematic. But what about this question of, do we actually get to the supreme creator in the first place?
So yeah, to kind of break this down, there's a premise here that says these things exist, and then premise 2 says these things point towards the supreme creator, and then there's a third premise that says the supreme creator is the God that you were denying.
Yes, sir.
We have pointed out that the supreme creator is the God you are denying is something that is tenuous. That even if these things point towards a supreme creator, that doesn't tell us very much about the supreme creator. But then we can further critique the idea that these things point towards a supreme creator at all, which is premise 2, I guess, in this structure.
That was perfect. That was perfect. And the way to challenge this is tricky, because for someone who looks around them and sees a beautiful world that's full of intricacies and full of, life, and it seems so inexplicable how everything came about. It's sometimes hard for people coming from this position to realize that there is a certain logic that they are employing to make those observations and then come to the conclusion that there's a supreme creator. And I need to point this out because my responses won't make sense unless you realize that you are using logic. And thus I can critique you by logic. Because sometimes I make the logical critique and people are like, well, forget the logic. I was just like feeling stuff, right? So let me point out the logic that's inherent here. If you see something beautiful, you're thinking, how did this thing come about? You do know that things come about because of a cause. The house that I'm in didn't just come about for no reason. You know that somebody built this house, okay? With things in nature, there is an argument from incredulity that is being made, which is, I can't think of how this thing could have come about through causes with which I am familiar, and you extend that to everything. I can't imagine how the world then and the universe could have come about by causes with which I'm familiar, and thus there must be some unfamiliar cause by which they came about. And then this leads you to the regression that unfamiliar cause leads to unfamiliar cause. Well, there must have been something that caused everything, and it is ultimately unfamiliar, and you get a kind of God. What I mean by this is that you could, by the same thought process, not come to the same conclusion. If I look at a beautiful flower and I say, wow, this is really beautiful, I don't know how it came about, but I know that things come about by causes. So I betcha that there's a natural cause that I could find by which this flower came about. It is the exact same logic, but they are both assuming different theories to explain the gaps in the logic.
Yes.
And that's fine. We have to assume theories. We do this all the time. But you can't say that the natural conclusion is to make your theory God, because that's just a theory you're imposing. It's just as consistent to make the theory, that explains the gap, some natural phenomena that you're not familiar with. And I will point out that it is the people who have chosen to make the natural theory claim who have advanced science.
Yes.
Not the people who have made the God claim. Although there's so much to say there. Some people are going to disagree on that point because they think that early Christian scientists were like the motivators of all change. And I'll just say to that it wasn't because of their Christianity that they did that. I disagree with that point vehemently. It was because of their assumption of natural causes. Their Christianity was separate to that.
This is a fascinating part of just religious thought in general, and this idea of using God as an explanation for things, because it is one of the strongest suits, I will say, of a religion, is that it gives you answers to questions that you've been wanting answers to, that you've had a hard time getting answers to. Like it's a big strong suit. And it does seem like basically you're given an image of the world just by living in it, and there's a bunch of holes, and then religion is just like, well, we'll put God in all of those holes. And that actually creates a complete picture. And that's a very strong feeling, to be like, I have a complete picture. And it's actually the most difficult thing for a religious person to leave behind when leaving religion, is that it requires you to be okay with there being holes in your picture, because you don't have a fill-in that can, you know, fill things in. But what's interesting, and this is so fascinating to me, is that there comes a certain point that you've been filling in holes with God, that you then turn to places where there are no holes, and you say, there must be God here as well. So the great example is right here, that like you have the earth, the things in the heavens, and their motion. In maybe in the time of Alma, but definitely in the time of Joseph, and definitely currently, there are no holes, or at least obvious holes, in the motion of the planets right now. We're pretty clear about what that is. If we were wanting to find like the potential hole that still needs to be filled, it would be like, where is the graviton particle in the fundamental particles theory?
How do we merge gravity and particle physics?
Yes, but the important thing is, the hole is not the motion of the earth. There is no hole there. We have a completely working theory of what is there, and it seems to be as provable as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, because God is a good filler for all of the other holes that still exist, like what is my purpose in life, and where does my sense of morality come from? These are holes in our psychology. Because he's a good filler there's this belief that God is also being useful other places, where God is not being used. We don't use God to explain the planetary motion. It just doesn't happen, because
it's fundamentally less amazing than it used to be.
Exactly.
Yeah. The statement that is being made here doesn't have the same kind of, oh, this obviously leads to God sense as it used to.
Yes.
Because we simply have natural explanations for this. And this shift of God filling these gaps is commonly referred to as a God of the gaps argument, if you're curious about learning more about that.
Yeah. But and the extrapolations that come off of it are the most fascinating thing to me, because it's like God was being used and serving a purpose in particular places, and then we found a better explanation for a lot of things that was more useful to us. I don't want to make any normative claims about better, just saying that like the planetary motion makes more sense than just God's moving these things.
Yes.
It does more things for us. And yet now we've switched our use of God to being just like, oh, it's explaining things, to now let's try and make God fit into this somehow. And you're actually not using it as an what's that word?
Explanation?
An explanatory tool.
Oh, okay.
You're not using it as an explanatory tool anymore. You're now like trying to work it into things, which is a big change in how you're reasoning through things.
Yeah. So look at this carefully. Verse 44 has got the entire argument there that's supposed to refute all of Korihor's agnosticism, and we've poked holes in all three premises to varying degrees there. So it's definitely something to look at. And I just want to throw out at the end, I didn't want to cover this a whole lot, as we mentioned before, because it's kind of a very particular case with Korihor, the rest of the chapter. But he is asking for something very specific. He keeps asking for a sign. And Alma mocks him for asking for this sign by just pointing out that he already has sufficient evidence. So you don't need a sign. And I want to point out two things. If he already has sufficient evidence, then that means that he's acknowledging that there is a reasonable way that you can come to know God. I want to point out that this argument that's being made here is not a faith-based argument. Not once does Alma bring up that Korihor needs to have faith and that God will give him knowledge through that. That is an argument that happens 2 chapters later in response to a completely different situation. This argument claims that you can have a reason-based way of getting to God. And that reason-based way is verse 44. And we have challenged that as best we can. And so if it is the case that verse 44 doesn't hold up, then I just want to point out that what happens to Korihor then is completely, it's just really bad. Because if it's not the case that he does have an obvious, reasonable access to the truth, then it's perfectly rational and good for him to question something that he's not rationally convinced of. And asking for a sign would be the most natural thing you could expect him to do. Think about that for a second. It's actually reasonable for him to be asking for a sign if he isn't reasonably convinced. Now, obviously, that doesn't work in this particular story because the truth of this story is that he does already know and he's just possessed by a lying spirit.
Yeah.
But if we remove that, because that's problematic in its own sense and maybe isn't generalizable, as we've been trying to point out, then what do you do with somebody who they're a non-resistant non-believer and they've looked at the evidence and they don't find it convincing? What is wrong with them asking for a sign? Because apparently, this is that leads to Korihor's damnation, is him insisting that he needs a sign.
Yeah. Wow. I don't know if that's the end of that thought there, but I have one thing to add, which I noticed. Scroll to the top of this chapter 30. So the only other time that they talk about an antichrist in the Book of Mormon is Sherem. And his argument is very, very short. The interaction is very, very short. There's not much there, but his basic thing is he comes and he says, I think he's talking to Jacob, and he says, you've been preaching about Christ. And this has led people to keep not the law of Moses, which is the right way. And have converted the law of Moses into the worship of a being which ye say shall come. This is his big critique. Like, this is prior to Christ. Why are you worshiping Christ rather than keeping the law of Moses? And essentially he just says, well, Christ is found in the scriptures, and then he gets cursed and dies. I would like to point to verse 3 of chapter 30 in Alma. Yea, and the people did observe to keep the commandments of the Lord, and they were strict in observing the ordinances of God, according to the law of Moses. For they were taught to keep the law of Moses until it should be fulfilled. This is Sherem's argument.
That is fascinating.
It's kind of interesting that they tie together so well. But the reason the people were being blessed and happy and rejoiced, according to Alma, was that they were all keeping the law of Moses because it hadn't been fulfilled yet. And Sherem's argument against Jacob is, you guys aren't keeping the law of Moses. To which Jacob responds, well, we believe in Christ and we worship Christ because Christ is found in the scriptures. So I don't know how you reconcile that one. But
that's a fun thing to leave people with. I have my own thoughts of how you could reconcile that, but you know what?
I'm sure there's a way to try and make it work. But it is kind of fascinating that both the Antichrists in the Book of Mormon have that connection there.
Cool. Well, if you feel like you need to resolve that cognitive dissonance, go forth, solve it. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this week's edition of Avocado Inc. I want to throw out that we don't particularly have any motivations for all of this, because this is a question that's been asked to me. What I mean by that is particular political motivations. My personal motivation for doing this is just that I have a lot of thoughts about things, and there are a lot of people in my life who no longer know what I think about stuff, because I haven't talked to them in a long time, and I've changed a lot as a person, and so this is my way of letting people know what I actually think, in sharing the things that I think are the most important to talk about, or just fun to talk about. So
no, it's true. And I also think that both of us, for the pure enjoyment of it, engage with these types of conversations, and we both have a shared history in particularly scripture and careful consideration of scripture. We're both like definitely nerds in this area back in the day, and so going back through it and trying to give it a kind of semi-rigorous philosophical critique is actually quite enjoyable for us. We like to do it.
It is. Yeah. It's a lot of fun.
So it's definitely coming from a place of like, this is fun, and we have thoughts, and these thoughts mean absolutely nothing to like most of the people in the world,
right?
But they mean something to us, and maybe something to you.
So yeah, just wanted to throw that out. Love you all. Have a great day.